I am Thomas Rodgers, Thomas Lynn Rodgers. The other day I am Thomas Rodgers, Thomas Lynn Rodgers. The other day I had the privilege of talking with the son of my namesake, or my middle name namesake, and that was Daniel McKinley, who is the son of Lynn McKinley. You remember that man? I was up in Dr. Nibley's little library, and Brother McKinley's been helping Dr. Nibley, or working with Dr. Nibley in some work, and as I've been in there many times, but never run into Brother McKinley. And we were talking about his father, who was my father and mother's neighbor and good friend at the time that I was born. And so I got stuck with Brother McKinley's name for my middle name. But Dan McKinley, as I explained to him, we did kind of a fast forward on Brother McKinley, on my experience and the things that it's brought out. And he did say that his father was a man of very practical religion. And he said that his father had also said that the reason that we were not being blessed in our health is because we were not living or understanding the law. And he says, if my father was here now, he'd be tickled to hear what your experience is bringing forward. Anyway, just a little side note. Anyway, I am Thomas Lynn Rodgers. I live in Bountiful. You know where that is? It's down the hill in Babylon. Or next to Babylon, which is all. Erase that in Babylon. Anyway, 5 years ago, I began a trip, not a very nice trip. In February of 1990, this picture was taken. Within 3 days of this picture, I was being worked on for cancer. I had a malignant melanoma. However, what brought that particular effort on was that I had a tumor in my chest, or in my breast. Now that sounds strange, right? I was a man, but I had a breast tumor, or a breast mass, I'll put it that way, because it was found later to be benign. But because that mass was hurting me, they began an effort to remove it. And in the process, they discovered that I had a malignant melanoma tumor sitting in my shoulder, with its tentacles reaching into the back of my head, into the base of my head, and into the back of my lungs, and wrapping itself around the tissues of my neck and head and back. This little melanoma had the exposure of only an eraser head on the surface. You know, most melanomas are presumed to be started with sunlight, and of course I used to run in the fields without a shirt. I used to run a dairy. My family's in the ranching business. If you go across this mountain, you'll run into all my family on my mother's side. If you run out here just across the patch here, you'll run into my other family on my father's side. And if you run down to Cache Valley and to Camas, all that area, that's all my family. If you go all the way down to the Four Corners and you run into the sheep people, that's my family too. My family have had their boots in the manure and our hands in the blood and in the milk from time immemorial. The Niederhauser Spindens up in Cache Valley are my family. The Gosners married into us. The cheese industry is our industry. My cousin out here over by Promontory has that large herd for his dairy. They used to be down at Woods Cross. We are cream of Weber. And of course, when you get down into Manti and Moroni, I'm the Jensen family. Now, my wife thought she married the turkey, but we do have the turkeys. And then when you go down to the Four Corners, you'll find the Reds. And they're the sheep people. So everywhere I go in my family, we are in the business of livestock. Brother Smoot understands that business well. My father used to be friends with his father, I presume, over there in Centerville. I used to run a dairy out in Sandy on 9400 South and 9th East. If you go out there now, you will find a nice shopping mall. My herd finally made its way down into Utah Valley. And whatever's happened to them, I have no idea anymore. But I was a rancher dairyman. My father used to run the church poultry ranch in Davis County. So at no time in my life of any consequence have I ever been away from the livestock industry. And as you know, when you're in that industry, you enjoy your own wares. And those wares, unfortunately, carry to us some serious problems. Cholesterol you know about, saturated fats you know about. The other things that nobody ever tells you about, however, are the high molecular weight proteins and the things that you better know about now are the pathogens. You know what pathogens are? Disease-causing agents, okay, are microorganisms, parasites, bacteria, viruses. And in some cases we consider some toxic chemicals pathogenic. In real terms, the only source of any consequence for any one of those four items, either cholesterol, saturated fats, high molecular weight proteins, or pathogens, is the animal industry. Now, which product do you think would be the best vehicle of all? Brother Smoot?
To carry probably the flesh. I don't know.
That stuff that you and I used to pull.
Oh, milk product.
Milk, it does the body good. You've heard that, haven't you? By the way, I have to preface all of this. I'm really going to hurt people's feelings because we have been slickly tricked by me and my family, and I hope I didn't knock out that sound system. We have been slickly tricked by my family in order to promote our material into believing that milk does the body good. By the way, when we used that little catchphrase, some people kind of squawked. It went to court. They said, well, you can't use that. Well, you get somebody in there like F. Lee Bailey, like O.J. Simpson's trial lawyers, right? And he just comes out straightforward and says, hey, we're not lying. Milk does a body good. The only problem is there's still some deception there. They don't tell you which body, which baby. There's no better milk or no better food for an infant than the food of its mother, the milk of its mother. However, I don't know if you people have noticed, but none of us here weigh 1,800 pounds. Now, some of us tried to get there. As you can see, I was pushing for 1,800 pounds. But I was not a cow. None of us are cows, and yet we're trying to use the things that are designed for cattle. Is Daniel up there playing? Oh. Well, I had a tumor in my breast. That led to the other cancer discovery. But why did I have a tumor in my breast? It is our love affair with the cow. Because not only is that milk loaded with calcium and fat and other useless things. Oh, did I say calcium was useless? Yeah, I did. But it's loaded with estrogen. Every female on the earth produces estrogen. Now, fortunately, Father designed the human mother and the goat with a very efficient memorial filter or barrier. So in mother's milk and in goat's milk, you can find essentially no estrogen. But in every other animal or mammal's milk, I should say the larger mammals, estrogen is passed through into the milk. Now, you and I are not designed as men in the human, Homo sapien, is that who we are? We're not designed to have estrogen in our body. We don't have the plumbing for it. Problem is when you dump estrogen into our bodies become confused. They don't know what to do. In some cases, we try to develop breast tissue. And in other cases, we have a little strange thing happen down below, and we end up with prostate problems. Or we may have that estrogen hit this gray matter that's packaged up in this globe here that, in my case, is empty, but not in your cases. When estrogen hits this area up here, we have some other things happen. Excuse me? If men have estrogen in their brain, they begin to believe or think or have confusions, so to speak, towards womanhood. Now you guys are probably saying, yeah, but I drank milk like my whole life and I ain't gay. But Utah produces, along this Wasatch Front, produces more homosexual men per capita than any place on the earth. Why is that? We have a love affair with milk. Now, there's another problem though, and it's not, this covers women. We have the highest rates of breast cancer in women on the entire planet. We have the highest rates of cervical and uterine and ovarian cancers in women on the planet. What do you think is the cause behind that? It's that same product. These young ladies' bodies, our children's bodies, our infants' bodies, and our fetal children's bodies with estrogen from the very beginning. Because you mothers are drinking milk and then you're feeding it to your children as soon as they get away from the breast. By the way, I hope you don't mind me talking plain, because we're talking biology here. So we have women that have problems, we have young men and young girls having problems because of our ingestion of dairy products and animal products. I was led into that particular area where I was trying to develop breast tissue, and I had no breast tissue to develop. So I developed a fatty mass. That fatty mass became a very hardened, uncomfortable piece of tissue, useless. And every time I drank milk, it began to try to change in size. And ultimately, it became a pain. I was a pain in my wife's neck, but I had a pain in my chest. The good thing was that that particular pain took us to the investigation and discovery of this monster in my back with his tentacles reaching up into my head. They did remove this fatty tumor here, and within 3 days of this picture, they're removing or beginning the removal of this octopus that sits in my shoulder with its fingers or tentacles running into the base of my head and the back of my lungs. I spent 3 hours in laser surgery, which equates to about 8 hours under the old conventional knife. And if I had been worked on with a knife, the doctors assured me that I would have bled to death on them anyway. So I am grateful to the advances of medicine, at least in that aspect. Medicine is wonderful crisis management, but it's not very good prevention. And that's where you and I have to come and assume responsibility. We have to become stewards of this temple or this vessel. But how can you become a steward if you don't know? Now this little square box that says here in your living room will never tell you the truth about breast cancer, homosexuality, obesity even. It tells you nothing unless you want to send in $600 to Susan Powder and get your head shaved and wear tight pants. You know who I'm talking about? Unfortunately, everything that comes through that TV is for money. And so that's what determines what you're told. If it's profitable, you'll be told. If it's not profitable, nobody's going to put it on there. Not even on PBS. Do you know that? In order to get the exercise fellow on there, what's his name? Oh, well, no, I'm talking about Culver Bailey. In order for him to get on there, there has to be something sold. Well, in the back of that program lies the exercise machine. And of course, what is that? $600 or $700 that you're out for that. I have a film that I let out called Diet for New America. I don't know if you've seen it. But it took me 6 months of pushing and shoving and haranguing these people up at KUED, Channel 7, to finally get them to let it roll. And the thing that was bizarre is this film I had to get somebody to sponsor it. Guess who ended up sponsoring a film that was contrary to milk? Cream Weaver. However, I don't think they knew what they were getting into. Because when we went to go for a replay, nobody would back it. Did any of you get to see that film last? Well, it's almost 2 years ago when I had worked so hard to get it on. Well, anyway, I have it with me, so if I can trust you guys up here in Brigham City, I'll loan it out to you, and it can go all around. Well, back to me. 2 months from this picture, a month more, they're also going after me for another 3 hours under laser surgery. And within 6 months, remember this is February of 1990, within 6 months this picture is taken. The man in this picture cannot see, can barely speak a few guttural words, and it's usually the words that come out of the dairy, the stuff that I used to kick around with my boots. You know, when you're dealing with a person that cannot speak, they usually are frustrated, and they will say whatever word they can find to say is usually the easy ones, the ones that are printed everywhere in your head. You know, when you hit your finger with the hammer, and when the cow backs you into the barbed wire fence, or when a bull sticks his horn into your stomach. In June of 1990, this picture's taken. It's taken on the day of my son's farewell as he's going to Chile. Earlier in that day, I had gotten out of bed. This is on Sunday morning. My wife and family were over at the church. I was not the kind of person to go to church. If I went to church, all the children in the rows ahead of me would be screaming out of fear. You guys didn't catch that, did you? See this picture, you kids back there? Isn't that scary? But I had gone outside and I was trying to stretch a tarp over like a grape trellis that was over a cement pad that we had, hoping to find an area for my ward members and family members to be in case it rained, and it did look like it was going to rain. So I stretched out a tarp over this trellis and got this pad covered, and as I came down the ladder off that last point where I'd hooked the nail on the last edge, as I came down the ladder, I had a pain come in my forehead like somebody had taken a railroad spike and a sledgehammer and drove that spike into me. And in that instant, my sight went out. Now, I presumed that I was only suffering a drug reaction from the drugs that I was taking for my cancer treatment. I had been suffering with that treatment for already 6 months. So I made my way into my bedroom, feeling along. I knew my property. Found my way in the house and got into bed, thinking that this thing would pass. Well, I laid there, and in the meantime, my family came over from the church, and of course the ward came over for the not open house that we didn't have. And of course the bishop and the stake president came over to make sure that the brownies were safe. My kid was really cute. He says, "We have been counseled by the bishop to not announce that we're having an open house at our house after this meeting." All 3 of my kids that have been on their missions, they use that little trick. Anyway, so the family and the ward members came, and I'm in my bedroom, and during the passage of time, my son decides to take my picture. And being the hero, or what do you call it, the martyr that I was, I didn't want him to know that I was in pain or that I couldn't see. So he came in the bedroom, he says, "Dad, I want to take your picture." So I followed his voice out of the bedroom into the doorway of the kitchen, which is right there. And he took this picture, not realizing I could neither see him nor the camera. I went back to my bedroom because his girlfriends had come in and drug him off. So he didn't realize that I was having a difficult time. I went back to my bed. An hour or so later, my daughter comes in, realizes that I'm in terrible pain, and so she gets me into the car and takes me up to the hospital, the VA hospital, and they say, "Well, this one could have killed you." And the doctor, and I say, "This one what?" He said, "Well, you've had a stroke." So now I'm not only dealing with cancer, I'm dealing with stroke. And as they went back through my records, they found that I had had 2 strokes at least prior to this, both strokes occurring during surgery, but not being picked up because of the sedation of the surgery. Because each time I came out of stroke, I had relatively impaired vision and slurred speech. Of course, what they presumed was because they had been cutting in the back of my head or neck and spine, that edema or swelling had caused pressure on the nervous system, and that's what was impairing my sight and speech and motor function. By the way, as I still halt, I'm still relearning how to speak. This is all 3.5 years ago, the apex of this. So I have had to struggle to relearn speech, relearn to function, and to get my sight back. So now I'm being treated for cancer, or stroke, along with cancer. 6 more months go by. My other daughter walks into my room. I'm laying in my bedroom as a vegetable, as normal. And I'm clutching my arm and my chest, my shoulder, and having a very hard time to breathe. She gets me into the car, takes me up to the VA hospital, and they say, "Well, this one could have killed you." And I say, "This one what?" When they popped the nitroglycerin tablet underneath my tongue, and then I again had the privilege of feeling that spike driven in your forehead, then I realized heart attack. Of course, heart attack and stroke are the same disease. It's just in a different spot. You shut off the blood supply to the heart, you got a heart attack or infarction. You shut off blood supply to the head, you got stroke. So now I'm treated not only for cancer, not only for stroke, but I'm going for the big one. So now I have a real badge of honor to wear. I've got it all. Well, not quite. In June of 1991, another 6 months goes beyond this, so I'm already 2 years into this fight. And on June 29th of 1991, my wife puts me in the car. I have to be put in the car. My kids are complaining. They say, "Mom, you got to get Dad out of the house. He's beginning to stink." You can laugh if you want. They really didn't say that, but it sounds good, doesn't it, David? Anyway, my wife puts me in the back of the car and takes me over to my sister-in-law's while her and my younger daughter go over there to feed or take care of her dogs while my sister-in-law is off to Miami. And I get myself into a kitchen chair and sit there waiting while my daughter and wife are out in the back taking care of the animals. She has 3 dogs, a German Shepherd and 2 smaller dogs. Well, the German Shepherd had been trained by my brother-in-law to be vicious. This brother-in-law is the kind of guy that if you give him a .38 and a pit bull, he's the king of the world. Mr. Macho. Well, we have readjusted his attitudes. As my daughter and wife went out in that backyard, that German Shepherd female began to make overtures that I understood very well to be dangerous. So I got up out of the chair and found my way down the stairs. I had some vision at that point. And I came down the steps. My daughter was at the base of the steps and she was trying to feed these dogs. Well, the German Shepherd female, she was not really trying to hurt anybody, but she didn't know my daughter and was defensive. And so I placed myself between the dog and my daughter. My wife was off doing something else on the other part of the yard. Well, the dog bit. She didn't bite my daughter, but she bit me. I'd put out my hand, to stop my daughter from getting closer. That dog went up and buried her canine tooth, that big one on the side, into my hand. And she locked onto my hand, and in my effort to get her free, I picked her up. She was a 70-pound shepherd. I mean, she's a fairly husky dog. And she was locked onto my hand. Well, fortunately she was locked, otherwise she might have tore. But finally she opened her mouth and dropped free of me. The wound that I had was not very bad, but it was all the way through my hand. In other words, it was like if you took a pencil and drove it down into your hand. Well, since I had been maimed, so to speak, by animals before in my life, I mean, it wasn't done by a horse or a Jersey bull or even a cranky female. And I've even been bitten by dogs. I was bitten twice on my mission because I was fearless. I'd walk into a people's yard and say, "Let's go baptize these people," and the dog would say, "No, you're not." Must have been a Methodist dog, or hope there's no many Methodists. Anyway, no, it was a Southern Baptist dog, Pentecostal. So I had no worry about this opening in my hand. I flung my hand, made it bleed, put a little peroxide on there and some mercurochrome. I knew the dog was not sick. I know animals. I just knew that she was defensive. Anyway, so I put a little mercurochrome on there and put one of those Mickey Mouse stamped Band-Aids and went home, went to bed, never thought a thing more about it. Well, Sunday morning, as usual, my family was up. By this time, I had 3 of my children out on their missions, my oldest daughter, oldest son, and foster son. Daniel and the rest of the children, my little boy, were with my wife over at the church. Nobody knew that I was in trouble, and I was delirious when I woke up. I was already into shock. And I did what a foolish man would do. I found the car keys. And with my shadowy vision, I climbed into the car, put the keys in the ignition, and I drove that nearly 10 miles from Bountiful downtown to around the corner and up to the VA hospital, you know, where the university and the VA are. Well, I did park that car so carefully. I wanted to make sure I was not out in the street when I finished parking the car. Later on, when my younger son came to get the car, he informed me that I was very careful about parking the car out of the street. My car he found in the shrubs against the building. Of course, when I walked into that hospital, the doctors again said, this one could kill you. And they began, like I say now, this is before my son come to get the car, but they had began their fight to save my life. Within 2 hours, they were desperate, and they had lost me. My wife was still sitting in sacrament meeting with the children. My 3 children out on their missions had no idea that I was in trouble. And when I was revived, with the first breath that came to me, I turned to the nurse at my head, and in struggled speech, I said to her, I didn't ask her for my family. I didn't ask her for the elders. Didn't have to ask her for the medical people. They had their little battery charger there. I think they hooked it up backwards, though. I've never been the same since. I didn't ask for the medical people. They were there, and I didn't ask for anybody else except a rather strange person. I said to the nurse, get me the dietitian. Now the nurse, she kind of reeled back on her stool. Probably ran through her mind, well, what does this guy want? Lime jello with shredded carrots? Or is it going to be the orange with the fruit cocktail? I said to her again, get me the dietitian. And she got on the phone in shock and called up the kitchen. And this sister that was in charge of the kitchen, Kathy Perry, came that long tunnel up towards ICU and came to my bedside. And I'm sure she was scratching her head thinking the same thing, which kind of Relief Society jello does he want? But as she came to my bedside, she knew who I was. I had spent 150 days on and off out of that facility, in that facility before. And you know, when you go to the hospital, if you're there at any length of time, periodically the dietitian or representative will come by and say, how's your food? And of course, any time before that, I say, oh, the food's great. And I would always compliment her on the great pork chops. And of course, the omelets and whatever else that she would send me before. You know, now that I look back on that, I find that rather curious. A man's being treated for stroke and heart attack and being fed some of the most non-stroke or heart attack food that a person can ever have. My father was up to Lakeview Hospital. I shouldn't have mentioned the name if it's on TV, but anyway, he was up there for his heart, and they were bringing him in roast beef. And he had to turn away his roast beef. He says, this is not heart food. Well, the lady came to my side, and when she sat down next to me, she knew who I was. She said, Mr. Rodgers, how can I help you? And again, with what energy I had, I said to her one very simple phrase. And I'm going to preface this with a disclaimer, if you want to call it that. These words are my words. They are my experience. my understanding, and my testimony. I share with you these words. Your agency is still number one. But hopefully those words might spur you into doing some looking and finding answers for yourself. And hopefully my experience will be an encouragement to try things that society is not about to let you try. Not only society, but our families and our community. But Kathy leaned towards me, and I said to her this one singular phrase: nothing is to die so that I might live. Again, she was in shock, just like my nurse. And so I did repeat to her, with the last bit of energy that I had or could muster, I said, nothing else is to lose its life so that I might have mine. Now, I didn't have any more strength, so she left me. And Kathy later related to me that as she walked that hallway back towards the kitchen, the Spirit pressed against her and filled in the blanks. She had heard that nothing else was to die for me. The Spirit let her know what those things were. She knew that I was not to have a piece of beef, a piece of turkey, a piece of chicken, or a piece of fish. Not a glass of milk, no yogurt, no cottage cheese, no butter, nothing of the dairy industry. And there, of course, there went my favorite, my ice cream. You know, living vegetarian may not make your life longer, but without ice cream it sure seems longer. But she also was made to understand that no eggs or anything of the like was to be made part of me. But the thing that really blew her mind, and I had to fill in with explanation later, was that she was made to understand I was to have no honey. Can you imagine that? A land flowing with milk and honey, and no honey? Well, several days later, she came back to me and asked me about the honey, and I was able to fill her in, because along in my ranching experience, guess what else I took care of? Bees. When you're in the business of growing peaches and apricots and cherries and all these things that are up on the hill, honeybees become your best friend. And the brother of Jared brought those bees to this land, not so he could have honey, but so he could have fruit and vegetables. Tomatoes do much better with bees in the patch. Cherries flourish with the bees on the trees. Now, human beings don't fare so well. I'll tell you what's wrong with honey before you get too far. First of all, honey is sugar. I don't care what you do to it, it's still sugar, and it's dirty sugar. Have you guys ever noticed as the bees are going from the hives to the trees and back, or to the flowers and back, that they often stop off at a what do we call them, a pasture burger? A buffalo chip or doggy doos. And because the bees do that, they pick up particular bacterium and viruses that are present in the fecal material of the livestock. The World Health Organization will tell the mothers of the rest of the world, do not feed your children honey. You can kill them. Infantile botulism. and salmonella, and the list goes on. Now, in the United States, we can't have children being killed by our honey, so we have to do something about it. We pasteurize it, but people don't like pasteurized honey. It just don't taste that great. So we had another option open to us by the pharmaceutical companies. Tetracycline, streptomycin, terramycin, ampicillin. I've used them all on my bees. Now, how do you get it into your bees? Well, you know, around the beehives you usually have a little watering trough, and if they're next to a stream where they go get their own water, then you have to do something else, and that's when you put in the big yellow tablet in the entry of the beehive it's a mixture of honey and the antibiotic, and of course the bees will snitch a little honey on their trip and they will be treated. So honey has these 5 problems. First of all, it's sugar. They pick up the pathogens from the fecal material along the path. Now you've got the antibiotics that could be part of that package. There's another problem, though. When the honeybee goes to the flowers, it's not only picking up the nectar, but it's picking up the pollen. And when the bee picks up the pollen, it has a little computerized system in there. So now wait a minute, if I leave this pollen untreated in this nectar, I will destroy my own larva. Pollen creates histamines to be produced in the body of any animal or insect. You know that? And if the histamines are strong enough, which they generally are, they will cause the larva to literally explode. So then the bee, in order to prevent that from happening, as it's making its trip back from the flowers, is a marvelous little chemical factory producing an antihistamine in its own abdomen, mingling it with the nectar. And the antihistamine it produces far outstrips in power that simple antihistamine that you and I are familiar with called Benadryl. How many of you are familiar with Benadryl? What do you use that for? Allergies and asthma. What it does is it prevents the histamines of the body from being produced. Now that creates a problem. Histamines are for a purpose. The Lord designed our system so that when we get a strange, large, complicated protein, which is what pollen is, into our system, it has to be expelled. And of course, the pathway for that expulsion happens to be either our skin or our inner skin, the mucous membranes, and the lungs, unfortunately. So, we take in an allergen, and the body wants to get rid of it, so it sends it towards the skin or towards a mucous membrane surface. In order for it to be expelled, that surface has to be stretched out so that there's big spaces for these big proteins to find their way up through. So the body produces these histamines to create that swelling. You know, that's the hive. Or in the lungs, it is the shutting down of your lungs. So we say, well, we'll take care of that problem. We'll just take an antihistamine. We shove Benadryl in the child or take some other strong antihistamine ourselves. And of course, the worst of all is this that you stick in your mouth and breathe. However, if you're going to suffocate, you better do it. But doesn't it make more sense to stop the problem at the very start? Don't put the allergen in the body. So don't put the honey in. Now people say, well, I don't have an allergy to honey. Well, you won't, because it has its own built-in medication. The problem with that is when your body is not able to expel it through the skin or through the lungs, it has to be handled by a very, very important organ sitting right over here. What's this organ here? The liver. This is the chemical miracle of the human race, of all animals, in fact, of every creature on the earth. But the problem is the liver's not really designed to handle these pollens. It can and it will, as it must, if you medicate it and force it to. But as it does it, it creates some very, very potent acids in order to break those pollens apart so they can be treated to a state where they can be, if you'll excuse me, handled by the kidneys and peed out. But in this process, the liver is damaged, and we have people walking up and down this valley and every other valley in the world where they live high on the honey, people that have liver damage. And they walk around with chronic fatigue syndrome or something similar and say, Carl, I don't know what's the matter with me. I'm so pooped all the time. That's not the only cause of chronic fatigue syndrome, but it's a very important one. John the Baptist did not eat honey or locusts. He was not a fool. He didn't want botulism, and the Lord wouldn't let him have it. Just to give you an idea what honey he's talking about, a dear brother Abraham Rabinovich back in Palestine or in Israel this last year made a discovery as they were working through the ruins of the Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. They found a date honey press operation. Say that again. A date honey press operation. What honey were they talking about? The syrup of honey. The syrup of dates, I'm sorry. And by the way, they didn't have just the dates as a supply for their honey. They had the maple tree. It was called maple honey. They also had the honey of the cane. What's that? Sugar or molasses. They also had the honey of the beet. That's still sugar. They also had a honey of the old rancher dairyman. Sorghum. Wonderful sweetener. And we give it all to our cows, don't we? We can pour it on the worst straw, and they'll think it's eating out at the Ritz. We can give them mildew straw with a little sorghum. So the honey spoken of in the scriptures by the righteous man, or consumed by the righteous man, was the honeys coming from the soils, not through the bee, but through man's own righteous, unextorted labor. And as a consequence, they did not suffer with botulism and depleted livers and the rest. But the Romans came along and says, well, we can't feed those Christians to the lions anymore, so let's give them some honey. That's where we got the habit of the honeybee. It was from the Romans. Boy, did they like us. I don't know if they understood what they were doing. They probably were enjoying the honey too. But you know, the Romans had some problems. They were a little unhealthy too. They suffered liver damage. Okay, one more thing about the honeybee. When you steal the honey, there is also destruction of the animal. And I'm calling the bee an animal. How many of you have operated with bees at all? When you go to pull your honey, do you wait till the flowers are open? If you wait till the flowers are open, you will find no honey on your boards. Because the honeybee has this perfect transmission or language between themselves and Mother Earth. They know exactly how many snowflakes are going to fall through the winter. And when they store their honey away in the summer before, they store exactly enough honey to make it through to that first flower opening in the spring. So in order for us to get honey, we have to go into our we have to go into our hives and pull boards before the flowers are out. Now, when we do that, what do we give the bees in return?
Sugar water.
Sugar water. You gave them old honey? Boy, they were kind. You guys were nice.
She works for Cox.
Oh, okay. And Cox is using honey back? Oh, they're old honey. You bet they do. You bet. You can lose a third or more of your hive when you pull your boards. You know, you may pull your boards anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks ahead of the flowers. That means if you don't have a good, robust queen, you'll have depleted swarms by, even at the end of the summer. So that means the honeybee has to recover from that shock. So there is a price that the bee pays. And, Joseph Smith in section 49 says, nothing in extortion. He also says in there, thou shalt not kill nor do anything like unto it. Brigham Young stretches it even further in his discourses. He says, thou shalt not kill nor be a party to it. So even the bee is covered by that principle, in my opinion. And the neat thing about it is every time we cross that line, or I should say the sad thing about it is that every time we cross that line and we destroy something, we very literally put ourselves in jeopardy and may even destroy ourselves. When you cross the line and eat the honey, you are exposing yourself to all of these problems, but at the same time you're destroying the bee. And when you cross the line and have the chicken and the cow, you're destroying the cow, but at the same time you are very literally destroying yourself. Okay, now back to me. 2 days later, my father comes to my bedside, and my father is a very quiet, unassuming, but a spiritual man. I ought to have a big picture of him, but you guys can look at these anyway. This is my father 2 days later when he comes to my bedside. He's about 5'6" and weighed 250 plus pounds. We could roll him or stand him on end. It didn't matter which way. He was about as tall either way you put him. Dad had been in the hospital the same days that I had been in the hospital, but as soon as he got out, I was still in. He came to my bedside, and while my mother, who is a licensed practical nurse and a mother with a lot of chutzpah, she won't claim to be Jewish, but I'm sorry. Get her angry or get her into a corner and you will find a very, very rabbinical woman. But my mother, with her nature, she has, the sad thing with my mother is she has her knowledge and it all fits on a plaque that sits on her wall. It says, I am a licensed practical nurse. I know everything in the world about health. And then, of course, with her natural tendencies, that makes a very impossible woman to talk to. But my mother is out there in the hallway at the nurse's station making sure that these nurses knew how to take care of her son. And in the meantime, my father's inside at my bedside in his soft way, and as he's there, I say, Dad, I have to share with you more than what I could share with Kathy the cook. I said, Dad, my head feels like the side of Sinai. You remember in Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, Charlton Heston goes up on the hill, And he is privileged to see the finger of the Lord right in the side of the mountain and cut out 10 sentences on tablets and to give it to him. I said, Dad, fortunately, Heavenly Father knows I'm not intelligent enough to handle 10. He only gave me 3 things to remember that I could share with you. And I'm saying that kind of boldly. I'm saying in my understanding, that's the safer way to say it. I was made to understand 3 sentences that I could share with my Father. And I share them with you with the same qualifications as I said before. These are my words, my understanding, my testimony, my experience. But as I said these words to my Father, they took him firmly and went into his heart, and they became part of him. If you see this other picture next here, when you get a chance, you will understand. The 3 sentences that were written in my forehead in that space are these. The first one was, be grateful that I have placed you in the hands of honorable men and women of science to save your life. I'll repeat them so you can write them. You don't have to panic. The next sentence was, now it is your responsibility to learn what you have to do to preserve your life. And the final one was that same sentence that I shared with the cook. Nothing else is to die so that you might live. Now in that first sentence, there's 2 very important words. Gratitude and honorable. Be grateful that I have placed you in the hands of honorable men and women of science to save your life. That word honorable puts responsibility onto the doctors, but it also, in reality, puts responsibility onto you. Joseph Smith gave counsel to his people, if you need to be treated for some malady by a professional or by some other person, make sure you're being treated by a friend. Unfortunately, the limitations of your friendship with the doctor end when your insurance runs out, or if you don't have a gold card to cover the rest. So if you do need help from a practitioner of any kind, I don't care whether it's a AMA or a naturopath, a chiropractor, a dentist, whatever, make sure he's a friend and he cares for you. There are many people in that business, or in all of those businesses, who do things unnecessarily so that they can secure for themselves a day at the golf course or a house up on the hill. Of course, I know many of them have to do some things because the liabilities for malpractice are so terrible. The insurance rates are awful. I've worked in the hospital system, I know. Okay. Be grateful that I have placed you in the hands of honorable men and women of science to save your life. Now, the next sentence I say applies to anybody who wants to take it. And I hope you take it. Now it is your responsibility to learn what you have to do to preserve your life. Who's responsible for you? Ourselves. And if we cannot be managers of this temple, our own personal vessel or body, how in the world can Father trust us with any other body or bodies? That's a pretty big order. You and I have given up our rights in so many ways. We've given up to the government. We've given up to the school system. We've given up to the medical community. We've given up to the food community. We've given up to the banking community. We've given up to everything. And we've sold our soul to this tube in the kitchen or in the living room. And we believe every bit of garbage that comes across there. And President Hinckley kind of laid into us heavy, didn't he? He said, be careful of that glass beast. It lies, and it perverts, and it tempts. It does inform if we make the choices, but it sure does a mess on the rest of the stuff. Okay, now the final sentence was the limitations. You know, I kind of picture myself as being part of this experience in the 23rd Psalm. He pulled me out of the valley of death, the valley of darkness, and he laid me down in green pastures. What are the green pastures? The wholesome herbs. Does that ring a familiar note? By the way, when I say herbs, I'm not speaking about something like ginseng or lobelia or some particular exotic plant. I'm speaking in the terms of the Hebrews. The herbs are all good, wholesome, growing things. The potato's an herb. A peanut is an herb. The grain is an herb. The carrot's an herb. Even the plums are herbs of a sense. However, the Lord kind of stretches them, and when they get up high to where you have to reach up, they become fruit. The fruits and the herbs. And these alone, or these shall be your meat, is the counsel to Adam. So he laid me down in green pastures when he said, now it is your responsibility to learn what you have to do to preserve your life. So he says, here, this pasture with all of these green things in it, but I put a fence around here, and like my cattle, I am not to cross that fence if I am to remain safe. And what is the fence? The fence is the slaughterhouse. Nothing else is to die so that you might live. And as long as I do not cross that fence, I will not be run over by a truck. And you've seen that happen when the animals have crossed the fence. They've become, what do we call it? Roadkill. Let's not be roadkill. You look up and down this valley, you will find roadkill in every house. We have been playing in the freeway with our blindfold on. And I don't care how well the blindfold is put on, the truck's going to hit you. And that truck happens to be diabetes, cancer, stroke, heart attack. There is a law irrevocably decreed before the foundations of the world. In heaven, let me say it right. There is a law irrevocably decreed in heaven before the foundations of the world. Is that the right word? Upon which all blessings are predicated. And whenever we receive any blessing from God or from Father, it is by obedience to that law upon which it, or that blessing, is predicated. And when you go to the temple, the very last thing you were promised or contracted with the Lord is a blessing of health. And what is that blessing predicated upon? It's predicated upon obedience to the laws of health. And you cannot bless yourself and you cannot bless your posterity until you come to understand those laws and obey them. That's a big order. By their fruits ye shall know the highest in diabetes of any place on the planet. By their fruits ye shall know them. Utah has the highest rates of breast and prostate and colon and all those cancers. Save only lung and liver. We don't drink and we don't smoke enough. So, aren't we embarrassed to let the world outdo us on those two? We better have cigarettes along with our ice cream. I know, I'm a little strange. And where else on earth do we consume more Ritalin and more Prozac and more Zoloft, more lithium, more amitriptyline, more desipramine, more imipramine, and the list goes on? Where else on earth? Let's hear it.
Nowhere. Utah's like,
Utah, we love thee. How many of you ladies, and I don't want you to raise your hands, know of someone or are on Zoloft or Prozac or Elavil or the gamut? How many of you know of children on Ritalin or Prozac? They're all over the place. What's the connection? Well, in reality, we have the Gadianton robbers beat. The only difference is that we barbecue ours first. We consume 60 pounds more per capita of flesh foods than any place else in the United States. Now, the reason we do that is because we don't smoke and we don't drink and we don't have our, we don't have our beer, so we have to entertain ourselves at McDonald's and at Wendy's, Peter Piper's, and Pizza Hut and Arby's. Oh yes. Do you know where these places began? Who started the ice cream chain? Who started the hamburger chain? And who started the chicken chain?
here in Utah.
Poultry, Pete Harmon. And I was selling my beef to D. Anderson. D. Burgers. D. Burgers started with a nice little stand there down in Salt Lake. A couple of months later, he says, hey, cool, we got a good business here. So he goes around the corner by the post office. You remember that one? On 4 South, down. Then they start going out like this, and D. Anderson says, wow, this is a cool idea. Well, Ray Kroc came to Salt Lake, and he happened to see these little hamburger chains, and he's a Jewish businessman. He says, cool idea. He runs into the McDonald's brothers down in California, finds their low-cost hamburger on the market, and says, let's go nationwide. Where'd he get his idea? D. Anderson. So McDonald's began in an idea spawned right in our own little valleys. Now, of course, Snell Groves, that's another part of my family. They saw what Dee was doing, moved Snell Groves out into branches and wards, stakes, whatever. Anyway, I'll probably get shot for that one. But they expanded out. That worked out cool. John Robbins comes to town. He sees Snell Groves. He says, all right, good idea. So we got Baskin Robbins. And then, of course, Pete Harmon, he's not far behind. He says, well, I'll just take and spread the... He went to Kentucky on a trip, business trip, and he found Colonel Sanders there with this great chicken in this little tiny back town restaurant. And Pete Harmon says, there it is for me. There's my empire. So Utah has spawned the creative genius in the marketing of these products. And unfortunately, we have overlooked the real problem. We have per capita more fast food outlets in Utah than any place on the earth, helping to sustain the lunacy that we're suffering. And as a consequence, we have more doctors per capita, more lawyers per capita, more hospital spaces per capita, and I hope I'm not hurting anybody's feelings, but more dentists per capita. And what supports the dental industry? While I've got you here, I'll lay it out to you. Milk. It does the body good. Is that what you've been told on the TV? Have you been told that milk is destroying your teeth?
Yep.
No, you've been told you need the calcium to build strong teeth. The sad thing is that the calcium in milk is not usable for teeth at all. There's not a single drop of vitamin C in the milk. So this calcium that's in the milk is totally useless in terms of building bone or teeth or even controlling the heartbeat of your heart. All that the calcium in cow's milk is able to do for you is to create sodium urate and calcium stearate crystals in your joints. What is that? Arthritis. And where is the arthritis capital of the earth? Utah. Am I hitting home with anybody?
Could you repeat those two? Sodium, what?
Sodium urate and calcium stearate, or calcium salts, combine in a lattice or lattice crystal or crystal lattice. They accumulate in your joints and your sleeves of your tendons. That's what's this called? Carpal tunnel. By the way, where does carpal tunnel take the world? Salt Lake. Unbeatable. Varicose veins. That's a problem with sodium urate and calcium salts. Did you know that? And we are the varicose vein capital of the world. And along with that, the hemorrhoid capital. Hemorrhoids. That's a bummer.
Where did the sodium urate and calcium salts come?
Well, the sodium urate is a formulation or a compound of uric acid and salt. Okay? The uric acid in the process of being circulated through the bloodstream corrodes the arterial walls or the vessel walls. Then it collects on the abrasions or on the lesions, choking off capillaries, creating back pressure. So you've got corroded walls that have been corroded by the uric acid. Then you got the plug. You know, the sodium urate and the calcium salts combine with another little chemical in your bloodstream called cholesterol and the heavy lipids, the saturated fats. LAQUE. It's not only found on your teeth, it's found in your arteries. It's not quite the same material, but it's close enough. Hydrogenated oil is another booger, by the way. Do you know about that? It's in every cake and every cookie in the market. Dr. Shackley has repented of that little beast that he created. Just like Dr. Spock has repented of his not interfering with the creative genius of children by never correcting them. You know that little story.
So, with a hemorrhoid, it's just
the sodium urate or the uric acid softens or corrodes away the tissues of the vessel walls, making them weak. Then with the plugging caused by the plaque, which is a combination of all this garbage, then you have shut off capillaries and the body's trying to push blood through and get blood into areas that have been shut off, and still there's that demand. So the heart pushes harder. What's that called? Hypertension, high blood pressure. We go through more Zoloft, Procardia than any place on the earth too. And what's the other one for hypertension? It's Procardia is number one. And Zantag, I think that's the other one. Sounds good anyway. You guys are totally impressed, right? The hemorrhoids are caused by the back pressure, and what your doctor does is he ties them off and hopes that the tying spot will heal. But doesn't it make more sense to stop the problem at the start? Because I'm going to tell you something, when you are closing off these vessels that are showing up on the surface of your body, what's happening on the interior? The same thing. So we have failed kidneys, we have failed pancreases, we have failed other organs, we have failed brains, because sections of that tissue or that membrane or that organ are no longer receiving nutrients through the blood, through the plumbing. The pipes are all choked up, and Drano don't work in us, or liquid plumber. Called Roto-Rooter. By the way, they do that in the medical profession, don't they? Rather than clean up the system from the front end or from this port of entry right here, they will take and cut a hole in your leg and run an auger up your... Ah, that's the point. The doctor knows the reason. Raise that hand real high. And if you've had a bypass or a angioplasty or an auger job, what's the plan? We'll see you in 2 years, or we will package you away. Now see, my father was headed for the auger. Now I should say the balloon. My father, who's a good reader? Let me have you read this little story about my dad. Oh, before I do that, let me finish off me. Okay. Now that I've dragged you through this hard science, are you all impressed? By the way, if you don't mind me bearing you a simple little testimony, Joseph Smith did not have the medical information available to him. He did not have the scientific information available to him. But 150 years ago, he understood our problems. He knew that our hearts would fail us, that our minds would become stopped, and that we would become a crazy people, a dysfunctional people. And so he tried to press us with simple little rules that would prevent that. And he gave us a rule that's so clear and so understandable now. When you go to the doctor, the heart doctor now, he may quietly say, well, we'd like you to increase your vegetables and your fruits and cut back a little bit on your meat. Joseph Smith didn't say that. He says, I want you to build your body upon the fruits and vegetables and grains, and only use the meats when there's a famine. How many famine have you guys been through this last couple of days? Breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And snack time. We were cruising down the road. The Golden Arches kept calling out to us, famine, famine, famine. So you drove in there and took care of that famine. You saved your family. By the way, when I was running my dairy out in Sandy, Ray Kroc came to me and said, I'd like to lease a half an acre piece of your ground for a hamburger stand. And I looked down the road that way towards Draper, and I looked up that way towards Midvale, and I says, why? There was nothing around me. And here's Ray Kroc asking me for a piece of ground for a hamburger stand. And what was his answer to me? You have a wonderful Mormon steakhouse just down the street. And indeed, at the edge of my property was the stake building, where we had 6 wards coming to meet. Wards from people way out in the boonies. But on Sunday, they came together in a mass, and Mr. Kroc understood the program. Do you know where there is another McDonald's stand in a curious location in the United States? Joseph Smith's hometown, where the 4 churches sit on the corner in Palmyra. Within a half a block of those 4 churches, Ray Kroc set up a McDonald's. See, he's smart. He's not evil necessarily, but a very shrewd, conspiring businessman. He says, these people gather here on the Sabbath, and I know they're going to be in the church for 3 or 4 hours. There's nothing prepared at home. Mom has become, modernized. She goes to church with the kids and the husband sitting there in pre-sub meeting, and they come out of that 4 hours or 5 hours of church, and the kids are, I'm starving to death, right? And they do. So they get in the car, the station wagon or whatever. They drive out of the driveway of that steakhouse down there in Sandy where I was. And as they drive past, they see these golden arches, and they have these big, wonderful toys in there for overgrown gerbils. What a wonderful family. I love you so much. I'm going to take the burden of preparing a meal off of you. He drives in there, flips open his wallet, cracks the green card, the gold card, whatever. The children go in, they play on the things, and their hamburgers are being fried up, and as soon as they get done, they come in and they all sit down as a happy family at a happy meal. A happy meal. Purchasing on the Sabbath, and purchasing the things to make those children crazy. I'm going to make a strong statement. Lucifer is the god of death. Death is his activity. Death is his business. Death is his products. Now, whose products are we purchasing? And by the way, you don't have to go to McDonald's to do that. Smith is just as happy to sell you that 5-pound package as is McDonald's. I'm an old rancher dairyman. I understand the slaughter too well. And there is no peace, and there is no healing in that evil sanctuary, where the cry of the animal is enough to curdle your blood. We sterilize that product coming out of that suffering and that evil and put it in a nice white styrofoam package. And your children never understand the blood and horror of that 79-cent package until they find their way into the psychiatrist's office. And the psychiatrist says, let's give them Ritalin. Mr. Kroc put up his hamburger stand, and let me tell you, within a couple of weeks, it was a booming business, and it totally blew my mind. Because once you've stopped there on the Sabbath, and you realize how tasty those are and how much fun the children have while they're there, then you will come back every other day of the week that you don't have a meal prepared. And we have given up, or we have sold our soul to that man and his industry. And you mothers have given away your children to people for money, for a price. Now, if I can say anything at all, I beg you mothers, take back your children. And you fathers, don't do your wives any favors. You go home and help them peel the potatoes. Or sprout the beans, I don't care which. Now, my father put these things in his heart. He weighed 250 pounds. He is now 78 years of age, back working with the brethren in Salt Lake. My father works at the Deseret Gym, maintaining their equipment. They had to let him go for 4 years while he was dealing with heart problems. He went through four heart attacks. Now at 78 years of age, he's climbing these ladders that are pushing 35 feet into the air to go change light bulbs in that Deseret gymnasium. If you want to see him, go down there and go visit with him. And the gentleman across the street, Kenneth, they call him Kenny Rodgers.
Okay.
And one day when Kenny Rodgers was scheduled to play at the Salt Palace, they called my dad over the public address system. They said, Kenny Rodgers, could you come to the front desk? Well, Sister Jensen, who works in the ladies' dressing room, said there was naked women running everywhere. Where is he? Where is he? By the way, it was my father who pulled that young man out of his car when his bomb blew up. Mark Hoffman. Yeah. The man was messing with the scriptures, wasn't he? My dad is 78 years of age. He now weighs 180 some odd pounds. And his doctor has been totally blasted in his psyche because my father's back is straightening out. My father was suffering with calcium deposits in his joints, and he was rolling over, doing the Dowager hump. Osteoporosis and arthritis beyond belief. My father used to cry to go to bed. He couldn't stand to lay down flat. So he'd have to roll on his side, and he would many times wake up in pain. Even though he has at the same time narcolepsy. If he sits in church, or when he used to sit in church and he'd sit down and go, we say, Dad, no, they're not praying. You know, and when the sacrament comes along, you got to give him the elbow. And my dad is now experiencing a blessing in that disease. You see, that's a disease we think was brought on by a particular virus called CMV from his first egg as a child. See, the egg is a deadly food too. Extremely deadly. When we're in the laboratory and we want to grow the best pathogens, the best viruses and bugs, guess what we use? Egg whites. Wonderful stuff. Right now we have hepatitis and we have meningitis running the city. And the egg is a marvelous vehicle for those. And is the marvelous vehicle for those.
Did you say egg for meningitis too? Like hepatitis?
Egg will handle just about every pathogen we know. If the chickens get it, we get it.
We have a very Stephanie Chaplin who lives in Manaway, very well-known writer around here. Got that meningitis that went to her brain. She was gone in 2 days.
We have lost several children this last week in Salt Lake City to meningitis, coming up with the spots that show up on their skin. And the first thought of the physicians is the flu. Well, by the next morning, the child is beyond help. And unless, well, they get a high fever, about 106 in the fever. And they will develop these blotchy things about the size of a dime on their face. Just blotches. If their own immune system handles it, they might make it. But we don't have anything to treat it with anymore. All these viruses now, and the viruses have always been a problem, but all these bacteria and parasites have developed some new resistances. At this moment, we have less than 30% of any of the pathogens treatable by any medication at all, and the last big gun we have is vancomycin, 1989. We have nothing new. If you don't have a strong enough immune system to fight these things in the future, and the vision of John Taylor will be realized in its full profoundness, where there will be not a single home untouched by sorrow or death. Now, there is a statement that says, the righteous will suffer along with the wicked. What you have to qualify is for the passing of the destroying angel. You'll have the diseases come into your home because people will touch your children and touch you. But if you have a strong enough constitution, those diseases will not kill you. And that's going to depend on your choices. Contrary to the story in the Old Testament, and I may be in big trouble for telling you this, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are ripping these delusions apart. It will be the doorpost without the blood that will be passed over by the destroying angel. See, I think in the visions of these early prophets, they talked about there being found blood on every doorstep. And it will be only those doorsteps across which no blood has passed that the destroying angel will not enter. Does that make sense? So when you go to Smith's and you grab a package of that blood, beautiful white styrofoam bottom, cellophane top, innocuous, innocent, you cross the doorstep with that package. It may drip or it may not drip, but the Spirit knows that it's in the house. Now this is really strong stuff I'm telling you, so here again you have to find your own testimony in this. But I will not permit anything of that in my house. I may be a hard, ugly father, but I don't want the destroying angel in my home. I don't want to invite death and disease into my household. How many of you saw Ghostbusters? Do you remember where Beelzebub was found? You kids back there, you know. Where was Beelzebub found? Hello? The lady was hovering over the bed, right? But he goes in the kitchen and he opens the refrigerator and finds the monster, the beast, in the refrigerator. By the way, what is the critter that tries to destroy the earth? The Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. What's in marshmallows? Eggs and Jell-O. And what's Jell-O made of? Jell-O is made of the hides and the bones and the tendons and all the trash trimmings of the cow and the chicken and the turkey and whatever else we can throw in there. We throw it in a big pressure cooker and we cook it just like you're going to do your turkey in your oven. And you remember when you're done with your turkey and you set it out, you cut it out, and then you have all these drippings in there. And then the next day after you've gone after you guys have finally woken up after being made unconscious by all of that tryptophan in the turkey. The next day you wake up and you find that bony carcass laying there in this gelatiny stuff. That's glycine, by the way. That's Jell-O. Glycine is a curious creature in itself because it interferes with the transfer of L-lysine to the brain. And when there's reduced or suppressed L-lysine transfer to the brain, we are not able to produce serotonin. So what do we give the child to replace the serotonin? Prozac and Ritalin. Prozac for mom, Ritalin for the baby. Let's have another bowl of Jell-O. We're not crazy. We just act that way.
We just have a brain block.
By the way, what is the #1 Jell-O consuming community in the world? You know, it sounds like I'm really anti-Utah, doesn't it? No, I'll tell you what my real motive is. I don't want my children to go through this. I don't want my children to suffer this. And believe it or not, I don't want my brothers and sisters to suffer this, if they don't have to. If we're not so thick-headed that we don't have to. But many of us, unfortunately, as adults, are very thick-headed, aren't we? I mean, aren't I? You guys are not. The real issue in all of this, though, is not food. Can you perceive the issue that I'm really pushing? It's function. As parents, as teachers, as mothers, as fathers, as guardians of our families, as guardians of our community, as lords over the whole earth, we must function. Now, we cannot do that like this man. How much temple work did I get accomplished during this period? How much genealogy did I get accomplished during this period? How much home teaching did I do? How much service to the ward members did I do? Zero. But worst of all, my children did not have a father. I lost my business, I lost my home, and I very nearly lost my family. They had in the bedroom a man who could all but gurgle in his own sputum. In many ways, I think a dead father is better than that. Because a dead father, they have a vision of a man functioning. But a father that is a burden and smells bad, at least emotionally smells bad, is less than a dead one. And we have many, many, many fathers who may not be at this crisis, but are closing in on it. And their sons come to them and say, "Dad, I want to go on a fathers and sons outing. Can you come?" And the dad says, "Well, you know, I daresn't go because my heart's giving me a little trouble and I'm stressed." So he sits back with his little black little clicker and listens to the trash, while the son, discouraged, leaves the room, finds a friend, and goes to the mall to be fathered. The daughter comes into mother, and mother's on her, she's on Zoloft or on Prozac. The daughter says, "Mom, the Maya maids are having a nice program. Do you want to come with me?" And of course, Mom's a little heavy, and she's a little spacey. The daughter has two choices. Either she invites Mom and is embarrassed by her, or doesn't invite her at all. And she finds the boy who's going down to the mall and says, "Let's go find some friends and do some fathering and mothering of our own." This is the disease that's rampant in our valleys. And it all begins with this little orifice right here. See, Lucifer doesn't come to you and say, hey, I want you to be a dysfunctional parent. Or he doesn't come to your children and say, I want you to be inactive in the church or gospel. All he does is say, or all he says is, you deserve a break today. Do you believe in magic? What's the new one? Have you heard the new one? It's good. They're all good.
We did it all for you.
We do it all for you. Oh, and there's that other great one. Beef, the real food for real people. Look how real we are. Real messed up.
You got the right one, baby.
You got the right one, baby. Boy, you guys thought you were going to be pumped up, didn't you, instead of drugged down into the pit.
So what do you eat in a typical day?
Fruits and vegetables, grains and nuts, and everything else that's there.
Do you graze through the day? I mean, do you snack if you feel hungry, or do you eat meals?
Actually, you know what happens is you become so efficient that you eat less and less as days go on. That's the truth. I start out with a grapefruit. Usually I love grapefruit. That's my kick. So, you know, as long as I've got Florida over there, I'm happy. If I run out of Florida, boy, am I going to be, what do you call it?
Burger for service.
Oh. I'm looking for a word. See, I have to reteach myself words, so sometimes it takes a while to find it. It's in the stack somewhere here. Would you key up, let's see. Suicidal. Without my grapefruit, man, I go suicidal. No, it's not that bad. No, I start out with a citrus fruit of some sort. If not, an apple, I don't care, bananas. Then I have a grain. Now, what do I put on my cereal? Oh, what are you going to put on cereal? Almond milk, cashew milk, peanut milk, sunflower milk, soy milk. Wow, there's one. Never thought of that one. A rice milk, rice dream. There's a whole bunch of things. And if you don't have those around, you've always got applesauce.
Maple. Real maple syrup.
Maple syrup, and if you have to, wet it down a little bit. There's all kinds of things to put on your cereal that are good for you to replace milk. Yes?
Well, do you eat any white sugar?
People ask me about white sugar, and some people get undone when I give them my answer. Because we have been sitting here with a grain of white sugar in this hand, and we've been going, I can't stand it, don't eat it, it'll kill you. Well, we've been chomping away at the Big Mac over here, or the Snell Groves. We get paranoid over a little grain of white sugar while we are swallowing the elephant or swallowing the cow. It's like choking at a gnat compared to you know, it says the eye of the needle for the camel. Well, I think our camel in this case is the cow, or the chicken, or the turkey. I discourage people from eating white sugar on the simple reason that it's a empty sugar. But I will not say to them, don't do it, ever. Because you make it so hard, you know, if you take all of the things away all at once, people just can't do it. So white sugar is okay. By the way, I would rather have you eat white sugar than honey, because there is no dirt in the sugar, there is no hormones in the sugar, there is no allergens. The chemicals in the white sugar process, I know the process, are almost undetectable by the time they're processed. And the chemicals that are in there are not so terrible. But if you don't want white sugar, don't eat it. But if you got white sugar around and it's the only thing you got, I will tell you this. Because it is a food coming from a plant, the Creator is not offended in that respect over the white sugar. Where the offense may be is if you damage yourself because of excess use. The brain does run on sugar, and sucrose is a good sugar for the brain in very, very limited amounts. You're going to get sucrose from it. Where did the sugar come from in the first place? The plant, the cane, or the sugar beet. There's nothing evil in cane, there's nothing evil in sugar beets. There is some folly in stripping that cane and stripping that sugar beet of all of its other nutrients and just focusing on the one singular compound. But if a little bit of sugar makes the oatmeal and the applesauce go down, I will let my children have a teaspoon of sugar or a little less. Okay, what else? Yes, fructose is a slower burning sugar. So if you want a white sugar, fructose is a wonderful replacement. The other one that's even more wonderful as far as I'm concerned, though, happens to be turbinado, or the sugar in the raw, because it has the micronutrients that are part of the cane. Now, what else? Somebody else always gives me white flour.
Maple crystals.
Yeah, maple crystals. If you take maple syrup and dry it down, it'll become sugar. It'll granulate. Okay, white flour, the same thing. I was asked, well, how do you feel about white flour? And I said to the brother, and I said, well, here I have a grain of wheat that's been stripped of its bran, bleached or treated some way, and I'm out here, focusing on this thing while I'm eating something else even more deadly here. You see, here's the trick of Lucifer. These people are starting to pick up on this health thing. I better not let him get too far into it. So he teaches us with prisms and mirrors and smoked glass. Well, we're starting to get a clear picture, so he can't get the mirror thing to work with us, and he can't get the smoked glass thing to work with us. What does he do? The prism. When you shoot light through a prism, it doesn't go straight through, it bends. And that's the trick he's beginning to pick up on now, because he says, well, they're looking through, they're cleaning the glass, and they're not looking. So he takes and does a twist on knowledge. And so he will guide you off onto the white sugar, guide you off onto the white flour. And in the meantime, you are blind to the thing that is really destroying you. So don't get paranoid over white flour. If you don't feel good about it, don't eat it. That's simple. It doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure that out. Oh, you are a brain surgeon?
Or a rocket scientist.
A rocket scientist. Common sense tells you that certain things are better than other things. But from my experience, the line is the death. The line is the destruction and harm and extortion of the other creatures who are our companions of the soil, or companions of this earth, I should say. And until we leave them alone and go to the things that are designed for our nature and constitution, disease will be our lot. It's really interesting. Even people who live on white sugar and white flour, along with a good supply of fruits and vegetables, they're generally pretty healthy. For example, all these runners that run in the Olympics are living on macaroni. On spaghetti. That's a bleached flour. And yet, Carl Lewis, I'd like to see anybody in this room catch up with Carl Lewis. Or Pele. Who's Pele? Yeah, the soccer champion of the world. This man just barely retired, pushing 60. Can you imagine? He lived on spaghetti, that white flour. Oh, the man must be crazy. He did not eat any animal foods. That's what made him a strong man. He did chew on coca leaves too, though. That made him stronger than he really was. I know I have a foster daughter from Bolivia, and she tells me all about those behavior patterns. They can go through a lot of suffering without knowing it. But in spite of that little coca habit, and by the way, the coca leaf is very mild, so it's about like doing coffee, you know, in real terms. But nobody can beat Pele in his performance for a lifetime. All right. Let me do a real quick fast forward. Okay, my father made the change, and of course my dear sister of the kitchen went back, made all the changes that she could make in my behalf. My dietitian. By the way, I call her my guardian angel of the kitchen because she was indeed my guardian angel. Have you ever worked in a commercial kitchen and tried to find anything that wasn't tainted with butter or prepared with some kind of animal product? It's next to impossible. But she was able to do it, and my father helped her out because right away he went down and bought a Champion juicer. By the way, I will encourage you to use a juicer if you can afford them. But they are not necessary. You know that Adam had a juicer? He very literally did. It's called a mill, or a mortar and pestle. You know what that is, right? Got any amalgam that you got to work up? You don't do amalgam? Good for you. Mortar and pestle and a pressing cloth was Adam's juicer. That was his blender too, by the way. A mortar and pestle does everything. It'll even do laundry if you're really mean. But here's Adam with his grapes or whatever he wants to do, and he puts them in the mortar and beats them with the pestle, or one like this. Who cares? Laid underneath, of course, is in a pressing cloth, a linen cloth. Now we know they take that cloth, and after they've crushed all that fruit in there, or those sweet potatoes or whatever, yams or whatever else they're doing, they take that cloth and. By the way, that's good exercise too. Keeps you from getting carpal tunnel. So they juiced. If you're trying to get out of the pit health-wise, I highly recommend you find a cheap juicer, not a J. Cordish juicer. He wants $200 for one. I was too poor. I went down to DI later and found one for $5. But in the meantime, I went to one of my wholesalers. I do appliance repairs, and I bought one for $35. Just a little inexpensive juicer, and that got me, it's still running. That juicer put me back in the functioning world of people. You see, while they were treating me for my cancer, I could not keep any food down. For 2.5 years, I had morning sickness, morning, afternoon, evening, and night. I lost more food than I ever ate. And that juicer was a way to get food into me that I could keep, and I would do little bits at a time, and I would hold it, and I would hold it, and I would keep it there, and finally it would stay. So if you have a person with dietary cancers or intestinal problems, boy, I'll tell you, the juicer becomes a godsend. And if you want to get your multiple vitamin shot in the day, ram a carrot through. Ram a yam through the juicer. That's really great. Run a yam through a juicer. Run a raw potato through the juicer. Can you believe that, a raw potato? Exactly. Those Irish people, when they were in the famine, they found out that they could live on the potatoes and live very well if they didn't cook them. Because an uncooked potato will have vitamin C and all the micronutrients a body can use. And you can live on raw potatoes for 2 years and not suffer any malady. Can you imagine that? 2 years and never be deficient. That's a pretty good little critter that the Father in heaven created. What a marvelous thing the tubers are. Oh, there's a possibility, yeah. Not only do you feel, not only will you be healthy, but you'll feel good while you're at it. Yeah.
I had a question about oil. Do you have olive oil or any kind of oil?
If you're going to spend money on oil, the only oil that I will tell you to spend money on, this is my personal choice though, but I have some other things I'll tell you about oil. Olive oil is the one. Good enough for the Lord, good enough for me. The other oil that is superior to olive oil, however, is terribly expensive in the United States, happens to be flax. Flax was the oil used by the Europeans, and you can go to Europe and buy it like water. And if we were able to find a way to set up a press here, I would do it.
Did you call it flaxseed oil?
Flaxseed oil. Why does it go rancid really fast? Because it's alive. Kind of like, I feel like Frankenstein. It's alive! By the way, there is a little saying says, the only goes rotten, but eat it before it goes rotten. If a food will not go rotten, it's not food. If it will not spoil, it's not alive, it's not useful. And most of the things you get out of the store have been treated to the point where they will stay good for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years on the shelf. You got a food supply in your basement, right? How many of you got 2 years supply of Spam? Oh, good for you. Spam. I'll tell you a story about Spam. The same man that tried to destroy Joseph Smith is the creator of Spam. Most people don't know who he is. Hormel, Raff, Tyson, Purdue, Country Pride, all began their little industry in Sedalia, Missouri. Sedalia, Missouri is a rather interesting town. Spit out of the window of a place in Adirondack, you hit Sedalia. Or you spit from Sedalia, you might hit Adirondack. Sedalia happens to be the hub of death. Sedalia was the end of the railroad line. It was the end of the cattle drive. Out of Sedalia comes the business of Kansas City, of St. Louis, and of Chicago. What was the big business of those cities? The slaughter. But it all began at Sedalia, Missouri. A little community established by the very man who would go up to Independence, Missouri, and with his knife would open women from side to side, spilling their bowels out, particularly pregnant women. He loved to debowel. He was given accolades by Governor Boggs and made the captain of that militia that destroyed the Mormon women and men. He is the man who ordered the slaughter of the buffalo. He is the man who put together the railroad running from Promontory Point to Sedalia. Now that's interesting. Where's Promontory Point? His railroad ran from Utah to Missouri. I find that curious. Another group of men put together the Pacific leg. George R. Smith. No relation as far as we know. And it's a little curiosity that I've discovered. I'm doing more research on this man. I have a picture of him with me. It's enough to make your blood curdle. But guess who buys more of his products than any people on the earth per capita? We do. Lucifer made a pact with an evil group of men, and when the saints could not live righteous enough to maintain the property rights to independence or to Zion, then Lucifer said, "Thank you for the land, it's mine." And he began the blood and death business of independence. St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, all hubbed around Sedalia. I mentioned the name Sedalia to Dr. Nibley. I says, does that have a interesting feeling with it? And he rolls his eyes back up in his head and he says, well, yeah, it does. He said, where does it come from? And I said, well, the man had a daughter, and her go back and check on the festival of Sed in darkest Egypt of the past. The festival of Sed, or the carnival of Sed, is a carnival of murder. And the interesting of this carnival are they're totally bizarre. Facsimile in there of a wonderful man, the grandfather of Israel, Abraham. What's Abraham doing in that facsimile? He's tied to a table, and there is a dark priest, and I don't mean a black priest, I mean a priest of darkness. Not necessarily Negro, but one of the dark priests of Egypt attempting to murder Abraham. What was the occasion? The interesting thing about the festival of Sed is that the king or the pharaoh is convinced by these evil priests that if he is murdered by the priest, that he will be guaranteed reincarnation. Good old Lucifer's counterfeit to what? Resurrection. And as I was digging in those records in the archives, the figure 30 comes up, very firm. When the king has served 30 years, but as I was reading in there, the Spirit pressed me, and I may be nuts, but the figure was not 30 precisely, but was 30 and 3. So after the king has served 30 and 3 years, he is to be murdered by the evil priests, and he is guaranteed reincarnation. And if you got arthritis, that's totally cool. No more arthritis. But the king is murdered, and then all of his riches, or as the king is murdered, all of his riches are gathered to either Alexandria or Philadelphia in Egypt. And of course his riches primarily is his cattle. The cattle is redistributed not among the poor and needy of Egypt, but among the priests. How convenient. And as I went back to Dr. Nibley and filled in those details, he says, oh, the festival continues. And by the way, this man was the man who engineered the murder of the prophets. Why? I'll tell you why. This is again, I'm preambling this as my experience, my understanding. But on February 5th of 1844, in the home of John Taylor, to the 12 apostles and their wives, a closed meeting of friends. Joseph Smith, it's recorded there, it says, had a wonderful evening together. And in the record or the notes of that meeting, one sentence is recorded and the rest of the page is erased or obliterated. The one sentence that's recorded is, "Not 5 years will roll around before I have this company living on uncooked foods." The record stops there. But I have the good fortune of having the canons. And in George Q. Cannon's record, another sentence continues forward. Now, I'll go back and restate Joseph Smith, and then I'll add George Q. Cannon's statement. "Not 5 years will roll around before I have this company living on uncooked foods, like unto Adam's diet." Now figure that one out. What is Joseph Smith telling the 12 apostles and their wives in that room that night?
That he was a vegetarian.
If 5 years comes, if I am able to have 5 years, I will work to have my company living the way Adam lived. And how did Adam live? The way God told him to live, on the fruits and the herbs. Now, there was a Judas in that room, if not more than one. They went across the river after that meeting, got a hold of George R. Smith and his group of cattle barons, and mentioned to him, I'm sure, the content of this meeting. Now, Joseph Smith had the potential to become the President of the United States. He was a popular person in the United States. People liked him. He also was contrary to the slave movement. And of course, the Sedalians, the Missourians, were using slaves to handle their cattle. What a bargain. That keeps your profit margin nice and wide. So this man is contrary to the slavery issue. He's a potential president of the United States, but here's the real kicker. People say Joseph Smith was murdered for polygamy or some strange religious idea. Can I tell you that in the United States, after this religious revival, there was every sort of religious people had ideas of all kinds. Why, just down the road were the people living polygamy in the Shakers, and people living polygamy in the Southern Baptists. And all kinds of weird beliefs were common through the United States. But the one thing that was unique was this issue here that he spoke of quietly to that 12. Even the Seventh-day Adventists were not vegetarians at that moment. They became vegetarians when a dear sister named Ellen White, who only lived a couple of days' ride from Joseph Smith, made a visit. And she loved what Joseph Smith talked about. And she might have become a member of the church until she walked outside of Joseph Smith's door and met some of the people of Nauvoo, like Dr. Forrester and the Law Brothers. You remember those characters? Not nice. They were buying up the land and renting it out for profit to those poor immigrants coming in from England and from Europe. And I think it might have been one of these brethren that walked over across the river and put the bug in the ears of the Missourians and said, "We got a problem here. This man could ruin your slavery, could ruin your cattle industry." Now, people don't usually get upset when you talk to them about some strange religion. At least, I mean, you'll have an argument or you'll get a little bit fired emotionally. But when do men really get ugly? It's when you hit their money. Now, how many of you have been through the temple lately? Could I ask you to remember some words? Something to do with gold and silver. I will take the treasures. What are the treasures of the earth? The creatures, the living things are the treasures. And with those things I will get money. I will take these things, and for gold and silver I will purchase certain things with the help of what kind of priests and what kind of tyrants. Is a man in a slaughterhouse a tyrant? You bet. And with something and something I will reign. And let me tell you, that's precisely what he's doing. And you see, that industry was going to be interfered with by a simple little man across the river in Nauvoo. And within 4 months, his body was splattered in the walls and on the floor of Carthage. I will put a stop to this business, George R. Smith decides. There's no way that this man is going to influence all of these people and possibly the nation and interfere with my industry. And of course, then Brigham Young has the terrible dilemma of dragging those people out of that city and bringing them to these valleys. George R. Smith, he says, oh, wait a minute. They're doing pretty good out there in the West. Better find a way to get our material there. Let's go for Ogden. Ogden's only, 30 miles from Salt Lake. We can cover all of that front. Promontory Point makes a good stopping point. And by the way, out here, Promontory is more grazing land, too, for them. So with the buffalo slaughtered and the railroad in place, there's another thing that dear Mr. George R. Smith does. He begins to work on the Lamanites, the other children of Israel. And he makes the finest deal with the government paying the price of selling swine to the Indians. Spam. The beginning of the spam industry. Now the Indians, our Lamanite brothers and sisters of Israel, are suffering rates of diabetes that make us even look sad. They're in little tiny little villages or communities, settlements. And they have diabetes at rates unbelievable. They're overweight, they're sick, and they're dying. Does Lucifer want them out of the way? You bet, because they understand this reverence between man and earth. They didn't take a buffalo unless they absolutely needed one. They didn't take a deer unless they absolutely had to have one to preserve their family. And the Fremonts that lived in this valley before were absolute vegetarians. Did you know that? The Hopis are absolute vegetarians still today. The Utes and the Navajos were agrarian people, and they only used the animals in the worst of conditions. And when they did, they gave thanks. And they gave honor to that animal for having sacrificed for them. How much honor do you give when you go to McDonald's? Yeah.
We need to stop a minute. Some people have to leave.
Okay.
So this is Faye. Faye. And also we have a few quotes here.
Curious.
He's a dark-looking character.
This book, I have no idea how it ever came into my hands. There's some really interesting things occurring. One copy of this in the entire planet, put together by his great-granddaughter. It doesn't talk about the massacre of the Mormons other than he was made captain. The rest of the pieces are fitted together from the journals of the saints.
Mean-looking creep.
This is the picture. This was a tintype made when he was doing the massacring, and this is a little while later.
What was the other Indians you said were wearing? You said Utes and somebody else.
The Utes and the Navajos. You know, the Navajos have always been the farming Indians, the children of the corn.
We've got an Indian friend that just started second Legion Crusade. He's very diabetic. Alex.
Oh, I'm going to give you another thing the Indians are dealing with, and that's called the hantavirus. Now, CDC has told them the truth, but not told them the whole truth. Indeed, the hantavirus is packed or is carried by the deer mouse and the rodents. But you know what? Try to find any intelligent Indian that will have anything to do with the rodents. They won't. They'll burn a house rather than go into a house that has mice. Did you know that? I saw them do that on my mission. If they had an infection of mice in their house, they would go in, they'd torch the place and start out fresh. And am I doing okay on this, Mike? I was cruising along one day in my mental drive saying, you know, wait a minute, I've worked with the Indians on my mission. They do not have anything to do with rodents. And yet CDC is telling them, this is the Center for Disease Control, is telling them that they are getting the disease from the droppings and the dust of the rodents. Now, I worked sometimes with a friend up at the VA hospital in pathology. His name is Reed Tainter. He was my cancer pathologist. He was my bishop at one time. And I understood when CDC went down to gather these specimens, in fact, I have it on film, they do not put on a respirator. In fact, they don't put on any protection other than a pair of gloves when they're going in after these traps, when they've trapped the rodents. So what does CDC know that they're not saying? If a man climbs underneath a structure with no respirator on, and all he has is a pair of gloves, and he is the CDC technician or scientist, and yet he tells you with his lips the disease is passed by the droppings and the dust, and he's climbing underneath there without a respirator. Does that make sense to you?
Maybe he's just stupid.
Well, he's either stupid or he is lying. I know he's lying because I know the virus. It is passed in blood or in body fluids. It is a blood-borne or bodily fluid-borne virus. Quotation marks, exclamation points, whatever else you want to put around it. The nurses that were dying, that were treating these Indians, were dying because they had their hands on the people, on the blood or on body fluids. By the way, how can viruses enter your body? No, you don't even need to cut yourself. Right here, right through this very tough skin of your hand, viruses pass with the greatest of ease. If there's some liquid there, generally. Dry skin, they have a harder time. You know, viruses, they got a canoe, but if there's no river to run in, they can't get very far. But if there's any moisture, I should say any fluid on your hands, either blood or saliva or whatever else, then those openings in the skin, which are natural openings, are sufficiently large for those viruses, which are sometimes less than 2 microns across, to find their way in. Now that makes it a little scary when you start thinking about AIDS and some of these other things, doesn't it? By the way, kissing is not a smart thing to do. Yeah. Would you guys come up and do a demo? Viruses can pass through this spot of your hand or any spot of your skin, anywhere on your body. They can go in if there's fluid on the body surface. And that fluid is able to be, that fluid becomes, your skin hydrates, right? We call it hydration, becomes wetted. And so you have a pathway for the viruses right into your body. Now, does anybody want to argue with me on that one? How many of you have got friends on a nicotine patch, an estrogen patch, or on nitroglycerin? Now, we used to give nitroglycerin under the lip periodically. Now we don't have to do that. We can just take a Band-Aid and stick it somewhere on the person's body, and it's absorbed slowly. Now, nitroglycerin is a monster molecule. Estrogen is a super monster molecule. I mean, this is a giant. And it's finding its way into your body through your skin. Don't touch things you shouldn't touch. The Apostle Paul had some good advice, and it applies very well for this day. He says, touch not, taste not, handle not. By the way, the rest of that whole chapter is about flesh. Lest in the using we all perish. Now that's an interesting phrase. Lest in the using we all perish. So if somebody goes out of your home and they bring something home, then all may perish because of this very ease of transfer. Okay, back to the hantavirus. Navajos don't, I gave it away. Navajos do not eat rodents. They don't handle rodents. They are frightened to death of them because in the past the rodents have killed them, and they know it. Bubonic and pneumonic and all kinds of good things have come to them through the rodents. So they avoid them like the plague. Now, the Indians have been dying, though, at a rate that's not explainable in their mind. Not only Indians, by the way, but even people up here. And in Tooele, are you aware of that? We've had cases of hantavirus death in Tooele, in Cache Valley, and in this valley, and in Manti, Moab, all over. New York State, Florida, California. The rodents do carry the virus. Now, the interesting connection is that each of the families that have had the infection have been rural families. So then, good, the dust and the fecal material sounds like a good logical pathway. The other interesting thing is in every single family, they had an interesting critter in their yard, typical to everybody else. The chicken. Is the chicken a vegetarian? A chicken is a carnivore. By nature, it is a carnivore. It is in the condor family. What's the condor? The vulture. Guess what else is in the condor family? The turkey. And if you've ever watched turkeys that are confined in some areas, they will start to peck and eat at each other, and they will kill each other and consume each other, and so will chickens. And if you turn loose a rodent into a chicken coop, I guarantee you it will never come out. My kids used to get excited when I would go into my chicken coop and I would move sometimes my feed boxes. And of course the rodents would come in, build a little nest under the feed box, and I would tip that feed box and those little baby mice or rats would be there. And as soon as I would do that, you know how you have your racks with all your chickens up on there, your roosting bars? They would come like, you remember the movie The Birds by Alfred Hitchcock? Shh. They go crazy. And there's not a single rodent that will make it out of that pit. Now, if the blood of the rodent carries the virus, guess what gets the virus? The chicken doesn't barbecue that meat. It doesn't cook it, so the virus is not destroyed in cooking. So then the dear Navajo sister takes that chicken, cuts its head off. She has blood all over her hands. She's plucking it, cutting it open. She's taking the entrails out. Her hands are inside the carcass. And the virus is in the carcass. And the hands are in the fluids and in the virus. Then she goes to the table. She prepares the bird. But at the same time she's preparing that bird, she's preparing the potatoes and the salad and everything else that never gets cooked. And then she wonders why her husband and her children, and maybe herself, are in the truck headed towards Gallup in a mad rush, or towards Shiprock and never making it, or to Window Rock. Blood to blood to blood. And whenever we partake of those things offered to Baal, we put ourselves in danger. Do you understand that phrase? Israel made the mistake in the times past of eating of those things offered to Baal. And what was offered to Baal? The chicken, the pig, the cow, the sheep, the lamb, and the fish. By the way, if the chicken carries the virus, the cow carries tuberculosis and a whole bunch of other, and the pig carries the influenza and other things, what is possible to catch through the fish? Everything. Everything comes through the fish. Why? Because where's the fish? It's in the sewage of man. The slaughterhouse is on the edge of the river. It has effluents running a little bit out in the water. By the way, how much water can you drink in Manaway now? My cousin up there, Sheila Niederhauser is her maiden name. I don't know what her married name is. They're living out there on the south end of the lake, south end of Manaway. They no longer can use their well. They have to truck their water in from Brigham City or from Logan because the water's contaminated with E. coli and nitrates coming from the cattle that are pooping on the land above. I drink very little water at all. Most of the water I get is from my juicer. Orange juice, and I do drink water out of the kitchen tap. You know, I'm too poor to have one of those nice machines, those reverse osmosis critters. So in that case I say, Father, I no longer bring harm to the creatures. And I remember that when your people were in the desert and they were bitten accidentally by the snakes, Your prophet set up a staff, a brazen staff with serpent, the serpent staff. And if those people had the faith, they could look upon that staff and you would protect them from the venom of those snakes. So that's what I have to do almost daily and say, okay, Father, that water coming out of that tap, I can't afford, I don't have the money to put in a nice system to give me pure, pure water. Please, if there's anything in that water, protect me from it. And the contract is set by me saying, I will not harm a bee, I will not harm a chicken, I will not harm a cow, I will not harm your dear fish. Is that a good enough trade? And he says, okay. No, I'm presuming he says okay because I am okay. Did we offend you at any... Before you leave, could we offend you? By the way, she has some, did you got paper?
Oh, I did mine.
Give him this one too. Probably ought to give him one that you got to take the calf away from that cow because you can't feed calves and people at the same time economically. You can do it. But in the industry, we don't feed calves and people at the same time. You don't make money. So that means you dispose or do something with your calf. 1 out of 6 is what I used to keep for my replacement. Is that about what you did on yours?
Yeah.
Say 1 out of 6 may be saved to replace your dwindling herd or your spent herd. But the other 5 go the way